I think this talk setting the room abuzz, or his, I'm not quite sure. Happy New Year. Happy New Year to you. This is the first lecture of the year of 2025. It's the first lecture, of the year of the snake, if you are Japanese, because they count the year of the snake on the 1st of January. However, in China and other countries that relate to China directly, they count it on the whichever date it falls this year. Now, before we start introducing, welcoming the new year, the year of the snake by Patricia Bjaaland Welch, there's a few things to announce. We have a big lineup of lectures for the next 2 months. First of all, this Saturday, we have a lecture series to celebrate the Psalm Society 120th anniversary. Enlightenment in this lifetime, liberation through the practice of Buddha's teaching, mindfulness workshops facilitated by Kun Bangkok Chao Kwan Yoon, who was one of the former president here. It will go on 2 different Saturdays, 18th of January and 25th of January. Then, on 23rd of January, next Thursday, Praetorian Kingdom, a history of military ascendancy in Thailand by Dr. Paul Chambers. Very interesting if you're interested in politics. Then, on the 6th of February, we have Rendered Invisible, Pom Mahakan, Bangkok and Cultural Rights by Graham Bristol. Do you know Pom Mahakan is the one across the canal from the Golden Mount, and the community there the communities there were razed down and became a park. And then on the 13th of February, Journey to Southern Thailand and Burma, by Olivier Evra. This is a book launch, which is happening tonight actually at the residence of the French ambassador. Now, this book is based from a journey by Pierre Lefebvre Montalis in 1912. On Valentine's Day, 14th of February, in the morning, 10 a.m., you wake up early and want to listen to Tracing Pali and Thai Manuscripts from Japan to Ireland, Collections, Collectors, and Connections by Dr. Justin T. McDaniel. There will be another intriguing talk. We also have study trips that still have availabilities. On the 8th and 9th of February, a visit to ruins of the Old Temples Museum and archaeological remains in central Thailand, led by Kun Oiporn Ket Choi. If you haven't seen China, Nakhon Sawan, and discover some hidden small cities, old cities, this is a chance. Now, if you haven't been to Lampang, Burmese and colonial heritage in Lampang province, led by Kun Tawib Ritinapakon, it will be another interesting trip. There are lots of Burmese influences in the architecture there. Then the following week, this is in Thai and also translated in English, วิกฤตโบราณสถาน unseen in พระประแดงกับความท้าทายของการอนุรักษ์ so the crisis of ancient sites, unseen sites in พระประแดง which is across the river, and the challenges in conservation, led by คุณวัฒนยูเทพหัตถี คุณทวีป will translate the trip. Then in April, discover the enchanting beauty of Bhutan in spring, led by Kun Pilaipan Sompat Siri. So here are the lineup for the next few months. By the way, I'm Tom Vityakun and I'm the chair for lecture at the Psalm Society. Here's another year that Kun Patricia is speaking about the symbolism of the animals. Now, the year of the snake. Snake is possibly the only reptile, if you're not counting dragon, because is dragon a reptile or not? Or winged reptile or not? Among the 12 zodiac signs. And in let's say global symbolism, it represents wisdom, strategy, creativity, or is it cunningness? Or is it represent healing? Is it because venom can be serum as well? It represents fertility, eternity, because it just never ends. It calls itself, and it becomes 08 and whatever. It represents our primal instinct, primal urges. But can we trust the snake this year? Or can we trust you to let us along what you're going to present us? Thank you very much. By the way, when Patricia speaks on board of cruise ships from Japan to the Philippines, if you'd like to hear more about things, you can go on the cruise with her. She trains dozens of ACM or Asian Civilization Museum in Singapore. I'm sure you teach them very well because I met some of them in Singapore. Yes. Now, we probably need you to come back and finish the whole cycle too, because we missed some during the pandemic, and we can get a box set of thumb drives for that. Now, Kun Patricia, thank you very much for coming to speak tonight. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I found that the minute I started researching snakes, I had everybody saying, wow, that is so interesting. How in the world did you pick that? Well, I didn't really pick it. It just sort of happens. But everybody seems fascinated by snakes. And I found one article that started with the expression, since Eve's first memorable conversation with a snake, they've held our rapt attention. And I thought how true that is, how very, very true. Except one of the members of this esteemed society, when he heard about this talk, sent me a personal email, and he said, Dear Kun Patricia, he said, you don't understand. In Thailand, a snake appears, we eat it. So I thought, okay. It's very easy, I think, to forget how terrifying snakes were to ancient man, and they still remain to most of us. There's this instinctive fear that primitive man had when encountering a tiger or a snake, and I combine these two creatures because medieval Chinese texts portrayed tigers and snakes as two of the most frequently beastly threats one could encounter in life. And it's interesting that the artist Delacroix reminds us of this in this 1862 painting, which is probably, many of you have seen it in the National Gallery of Art. So many experts really believe that our fear of snakes is genetically encoded in us, and that this fear has simply been passed on through human ancestry. So why and how then did snakes end up as one of the 12 animals of the Chinese zodiac? The most popular children's story relating how the animals were chosen and arranged, I know is known to most of you. It's the tale of how the Jade Emperor awarded positions on the calendar according to how animals placed in a race. And the race included a journey across a very turbulent river. The crafty rat jumped on the back of the strongest swimmer, the ox, who, being not very bright, agreed to the idea. So the rat jumped off ahead of the ox and came in first. The ox comes in second. The tiger comes in third, and the rabbit fourth. The rabbit wasn't very capable of swimming, but it was smart enough to be able to hop from rock to rock and then to a floating log. The mighty dragon was fifth, as those of you who were last year's guests remember. Meanwhile, that wily snake was wrapping itself around the fast-running horse's leg, and as it neared the end, it slithered free to scare the horse, so it came in sixth, and the horse comes in seventh. Well, if you think about this story, what sort of story is this to tell children? He cheats, he scares a horse. Is this really a children's story? But I discovered that somehow along the line, these snakes have apparently acquired a PR company to transform their image. Because last year, when I was visiting the museum in Bath, England, I found this painted on the wall of the museum as the attributes of snakes. Look at this. Charming, introverted, generous, and smart. Okay. So I decided let's start at the beginning and see if we can piece together all the different roles that snakes have played in Chinese art and symbolism. How, in the end, did they really win a place on the Chinese zodiac calendar? One academic who specializes in how animals have been seen through Chinese history has written that snakes, like other non-human animals, can exist in multiple layers of human experience, affected by cultural, as you see here, historical, physical, and psychological, cognitive factors, which are often intermingled and mutually influenced by each other. In other words, what we've read or heard about snakes or from our friends' encounters with snakes and our own perceptions and or expectations as a result of reading or hearing about others' experiences, whether they're factual or not, really do affect the way we feel about snakes. And as Balaji Mundker writes in his lovely book, The Cult of the Serpent, which I highly recommend, snakes are often poisonous, and their movement causes a physiological reaction of fear and ambivalent awe in all higher primates, including man. So there is a reason why snakes are a universal motif in primitive art. Here was one of my moments of encounter. I've run into a few snakes over the years I've traveled in China, but this was the only one I managed to capture with my camera before turning and running like a crazy woman away from it. It turned out to be a harmless dice snake, but I definitely experienced that psychological, cognitive category of reaction. I attest to it. So are snakes the precursors of dragons in China? This is the question we're going to be returning to several times, and I'm going to start with this very famous, or now very famous, bowl. This was one of only 4 that were found, or have been found to date, unearthed from an archaeological site in Shanxi province. It was on display for the first time last year at the Shanxi Museum, and I had to wait 3 hours in line to get into the museum to see this bowl. The Chinese authorities declared it to be a dragon, on account of that little bulge above the head where you see I've put a green arrow. But looking at its markings and comparing it with this chart of indigenous snakes in China, I would have identified it as a rat snake, especially given the geographic location of the ancient Lungshan culture, where this early earthenware bowl was found. The belief in the dragon being a descendant of a snake is based in part on the large number of gods and supernatural beings that appear in early Chinese folklore, legends, and early art. Many of whom, although having a snake body, are described as having either a dragon or a human face, and so were believed by the Chinese to have actually been their physical ancestors. One of the earliest references to such composite snake-human figures in China is found in a book called the Shanhai Jing, or the Classic of Mountains and Seas, which is credited to the mythical founder of the Xia dynasty. But most likely it wasn't compiled until later, somewhere probably between the 4th and 1st century BCE. The book, or the story, was then more or less forgotten for about 1,000 years, but then it was rediscovered and became regarded suddenly as China's major origin story. It describes a world where the sky is a round canopy composed of 9 layers, covering a square earth. It identifies 3,000 place names and names and descriptions of hundreds of thousands of animals and beings. And in it are several human snake composite figures. The pages are filled with stories of figures with snakes in their ears or human heads, as you see in the illustrations I have for you here. This was a very unique record of beliefs held by the ancient Chinese that portrayed a world full of strange beings that they believed, or so they said, existed right alongside mankind. In the pages you find a god named Rusho, whom you see here, who is said to like to ride about on 2 dragons. He had a human face, white hair, tiger claws, and a snake living in his left ear, which is that funny little curl you see coming out, while the other gods just hold their snakes or sometimes wear them on their head. And as one scholar wrote, these creatures were regarded as actual entities found throughout the world who dwelled alongside humans and who were therefore obliged to learn to coexist with them. Okay. Last year, archaeologists in Taiwan returned to continue excavating a sand dune that had previously yielded a large number of prehistoric archaeological finds. And this time they discovered a snake-shaped artifact that carbon tested to about 4,000 years old. They believe it was it's just one piece but photographed from different angles. They believe it was a handle that once formed part of a pottery vessel, and they believe it was probably used in ancient rituals. And because it appears to resemble a cobra with its head raised and the skin folds of its head and neck bulging, the archaeologists are pretty sure that it came from a sacrificial vessel, which would be evidence of the possible identification of snakes with the culture's religious belief that they were, in fact, the descendants of true snakes. Now, the belief that one's ancestors were plants or animals is known as totemism. And the term it was derived actually by an Englishman in the late 1700s who was traveling and doing work in North America, studying different Indian tribes, which is why the term is called totemism. In China, we can trace totemism back for about 2,000 years, and one can still find ethnic groups who have retained the names of the plants and animals that they believe were their ancestors or their ancestral tribes. And you can find it even in the written characters of many Chinese names even today. And that only underscores the importance of that relationship to that particular plant or animal. China's totems were usually geographically based, with each region known for certain totems. Most of the totems were animals, but sometimes plants do appear. For example, the Miao, certain Miao tribes of southern China identify themselves with trees, with the maple tree, in fact, as their ancestors. In ancient times, bears were the most common totems in the north of China. Dogs in the center of China, and snakes in the south. And the memory of these ancient snake totems can still be found on the textiles of some of China's indigenous ethnic groups. Many handicrafts have what appear to be snake patterns if you look closely at them. There's a snake worship ceremony every year, for example, in Fujian on the first lunar month, during which the Dung tribal people actually make snakeskin clothes and wear them to dance a dance which is taught to all the children called the snake dance. The Qiang people of Sichuan believe that snakes are good luck. If they meet a snake on the road, they think it's an auspicious sign. And if you look carefully at that Guizhou resist dyed piece, you can see snake-like patterns on that too, even though many of us have forgotten their possible origins. And this again raises the question of, is the snake the prototype of the dragon? Or is it in part, writes one scholar, is it because the dragon's continued socio-historical significance in China makes the dragon important? Or is it because the snake was important? At any rate, he says, we find snakes so often in Chinese history, he said, we really should regard the dragon as the totem of the entire Chinese nation, which I think is sort of an interesting thought as we approach Chinese New Year. China has got a number of authorized creation myths that explain the origin of the universe and Earth and mankind, and one of the best known is the myth of Pangu, who's credited with being the creator of the universe in the record of myriad things. And the story goes that upon awakening from a long sleep, he first split the heavens from the earth, dividing yin and yang, which included even the animals, into those possessing the most yin-ness or yang or yangness. And you see the snake is on the yin list, okay? Pangu is usually depicted as a dwarf clothed in leaves, as you see here, holding the symbols of yin and yang respectively. After many years, he dies, and his body becomes the sun, the moon, the stars, the mountains, the rivers, the forests, and everything else in creation. And from this primordial creation, a goddess appears by the name of Nuwa. And she finds that the four pillars that were supposed to be holding up heaven and earth are broken. So the first thing she does is repair them. Then, after a little bit of a rest, she begins to fashion mankind from clay, and along with her brother, Fu Shi, breathes life into them. Fu Shi then taught humans the arts of hunting, fishing, and cooking. These two figures are typically depicted, as you see here, as half human and half snake, and they are China's legendary creators of mankind. They're human from the torso up, but serpent-like from the torso down, with their respective tails often entwined, and they each hold a tool which they're identified with. Niwa holds a heavenly compass, and Fuxi a carpenter's square. The story was first recorded during the Han Dynasty, probably around the 3rd century, but was most likely an older oral myth. Now, the small picture is a rubbing that you can see in Taipei's National Museum of History, and it's entitled by the scholars there simply The Sun God. The source is unknown, it is undated, but most scholars believe it's probably dating back to the Shang Dynasty. And scholars believe that the whole idea of the sun and moon doesn't become associated with this primordial brother and sister until later. It's somehow a later addition to help show the extra powers that they have over controlling nature, etc. But in the belief that they were mankind's ancestors, they were depicted on funeral banners and tombstones and the like to serve as guardian spirits after death, until about, the 5th or the 6th century. And they are a very important key to understanding some of the motifs we find when we go to visit museums in China and elsewhere, and we take a really good look at some of those ancient bronzes. Snakes serve as symbols of transformation and rebirth in many cultures. So they are linked both to the world of the living as well as to the world of the dead. And perhaps suggest some scholars because they were seen to be able to live in both water and on land. And furthermore, snakes would disappear in the winter and then they would reappear, apparently reborn in the spring, the reborn idea being because they would come with new skins on their bodies. So this raised the questions of, is there some sort of rebirth or transformation power that snakes have? And now we come to the question as to, therefore, should snakes be feared or should they be seen as guardian spirits with the power of rebirth or new life after death? This is one of the oldest depictions we believe we have, combining both serpent and human aspects. So here we have a human-headed snake decorating the legs of a Shang Dynasty bronze vessel, and on the right, who you see is Fuxi. And according to the scholar Sarah Ellen, who I think is one of the best scholars working in the field of ancient Chinese symbology, these ritual vessels that held designs like this were decorated on purpose in, quote, what she calls the language of the spirit world, so that the boundary between the living and the dead shows that it can be crossed. And the sacrifice received by those for whom the food or the offerings inside the container are contained, it shows that that transmigration will occur just as snakes can somehow give birth again, so can humans. So this is consistent, interestingly, with the appearance of the snake and oracle bone inscriptions that we have. When we look at pictograms relating either to illness or to death or sacrifice, they often contain pictograms of snakes. For example, the pictorial word for curse in Chinese, in ancient bronzes, is a drawing of a foot stepping on the head of a snake. And a picture of a snake in an altar had the meaning of a cult year, or the passing of 1 year's time. Now, the Chinese character on the right depicts 3 snakes, scholars say, or worms, in a vessel. And on the left, you see the original pictograph as it appeared on ancient bronzes. And the meaning is an illness, because in years past, an illness was understood as being caused by an evil power. So that would have to be snake venom that was served to one in a vessel. Interesting. Here you see the modern character that means snake. Now, the component on the left, which is what's known as a radical, identifies the category that snakes belong to as being insect or things like insects. And the right-hand side of this character indicates the sound that's associated with the Chinese word for snake, the sound for the word tongue, because a snake's tongue was probably the most distinctive element of a snake's physical body for ancient mankind. So when these two components are combined, we have the Chinese character for snake. And this reflects quite well, I think, both the snake's nature, it is an insect-like animal, I guess, and its characteristics. I think a society's expressions or idioms give us really interesting insights into a society's culture and beliefs, and luckily most scholars belong with me. So here are 5 of the most common idioms in Chinese that refer to snakes, and I'm going to give you a few seconds to take a look and read the slide. Interesting, aren't they? They're so interesting, I've begun using them in some of my conversations with students who think it's very amusing. When we examine China's relics from the past, we get even more clues as to the historic relationship between snakes and dragons in China. For example, this early Shang, so that means it's sometime between the 16th and 11th century BCE, appears to depict snakes together with dragons. But does it? We're very hard-pressed to find other early examples. This is the only one that scholars believe we have to date, because the vast majority of these early bronze artifacts really depict only snakes, as you see here on this later Eastern Zhou period piece. This dates from about the 8th to the 3rd century BCE. And you see that coiling snake motif consisting of very tightly packed, wiggling, small, stylized snake-like patterns that keep repeating over and over again. Snakes became a very popular motif during the Warring States period, so as we approach the year 0, such as you see on this lacquer cup with a lid showing a bird overpowering what appears to be intertwined snakes. This period was rich with depictions of combinations of beasts, such as phoenixes standing over a tiger or bird grasping a snake, which some experts believe may be alluding to the ceaseless cycles of nature. This incredible bronze was on display in San Francisco last year, and one of my trainees from the museum in Singapore brought it to my attention when they knew I was working on this topic. It's an extraordinary stand made of writhing serpent-like forms, which served as the base for a horizontally mounted drum, which was played by somebody standing above it with 2 short sticks. If you look at it carefully, there's a circular base, there are 4 ring handles, there's a shaft, and there's a dramatic grouping of 16 upwardly writhing large serpents. And there are 8 different types, 2 of each type differing in size, and the head shape differs as well. And then there are numerous smaller serpents that are intertwined with the larger ones, and the whole thing, doesn't it look more like a flickering flame than what it is, which is basically a whole pile of snakes. Here's another Warring States period artifact. This is a jade disc. Now, note the triangular snake heads on the intertwined serpents. But what in the world are those little barbs on the side of their body all about? Snakes don't have barbs like that. Are these snakes that are transforming into dragons? This could be their meaning, according to the late curator of the Shanghai Museum and some other eminent scholars, because he, along with a handful of other scholars, believe that the dragon is in reality a deified version of the snake, which is something worth thinking about. But this piece from that same period, that same Warring State period, shows the 2 in juxtaposition. And it may be one of the earliest pieces we have showing a true differentiation between dragons and snakes. So note that the dragons have horns, claws, and long rolled snouts. Whereas the snakes, those are the 2 smaller figures on the edges, have very distinctive snake-shaped heads and no appendages. And the 2 yet are often mentioned together in Chinese texts. For example, when you're talking about natural habitats in Chinese texts, like you use an expression, gorges and streams, they're described often as being the homes of both snakes and dragons. And this is partly the result of the Chinese belief that animals are linked with the terrains in which they live. It's more than a physical link. It's more of a link of ownership and a belief. In ancient times, when Chinese armies marched through various terrains, they had a flag that they would show that would depict the terrain they were covering. And it would differ from swamp areas to mountainous areas to flat plains. And they would use animal pictures. They wouldn't show a mountain. They would show a picture of a mountain goat instead on the flag, because of this unique belief that animals and terrains are united. So then when we look at these pieces, we have to ask questions. Okay, snakes are obviously deliberate motifs. They aren't just decorations. But what is their early meaning? There are no inscriptions. We have no idea of what these artifacts are supposed to mean to us. Look at this artifact on the left. It shows 2 lacquered wooden birds standing on a base of 2 entwined bronze snakes. What in the world does that mean? Scholars have absolutely no idea. We know that the motif of birds holding or catching snakes was popular, as you can see decorating the rim of this ritual wine vessel that you see in the upper right-hand corner. And we can associate birds with the sky and snakes with the underworld, but the exact meaning of their being shown together is still disputed. Is this trying to show the universe, heaven and earth? Is there some sort of captive and captor out of this? We don't know. Here you see a tomb guardian from the Taipei National Museum of History with 4 curling things. That's exactly the words a curator used to describe this to me. Curling things on its head, standing on 2 serpents. But the archaeologists and museum experts are undecided as to the symbolism and what this artifact might have even been used for. There's one theory, though, that has arisen from the presence of some of the strange funerary artifacts you find during that Warring States period. Before they came under what they call the dominating influence of the northern civilization that came with the Han dynasty. So that's right around 200 BC to 200 AD. These are the figures that are usually carved in wood, but are also sometimes lacquered, as you see on the top right, that you find in funeral settings, especially in central Henan province. And these figures have these long, elaborate antlers. Their faces have protruding tongues, and they sometimes grasp and devour snakes. So the interpretation of these figures suggests that they are protector figures whose function was to ward off evil influences. Is the snake now supposed to be an evil influence? But supposed to ward off evil influences from the deceased persons. We know many cultures throughout the globe use a hanging tongue to depict scaring away things that are frightful. Or is it perhaps to keep the dead, sloughed off body from returning to this world? We simply have no idea what these sculptures were used for. But now I want to turn to this very famous painted silk funerary banner. I talk about this a lot because it's such an important find. This was found in the Mawangdui tombs near Changsha, China, and it dates to about 168 BC. It was draped over the coffin of an aristocratic female whom we only know by the name of Lady Dai, and it dates to the Western Han. The Warring States period and this early Han were times that really harbored the belief in bodily transformations, including that very real possibility for immortality. So you see on this funerary banner, which employs, by the way, both Confucian and Taoist beliefs, the path that Lady Dao will take as newly deceased. It begins with her death at the bottom of the banner, and then you follow her walk up through the banner until the very top. So her path begins in the underworld at the bottom. There you see her with her cane. And by the way, when they opened the coffin, which this cloth was covering, they found not only the skeleton of Lady Dai, they found her walking stick had been buried with her. So we know that this was painted from somebody who actually knew her. And then if you look at the design, we see 2 very sinuous serpent bodies knotted through a circle jade ring, above which is a scene symbolizing her funeral feast, and it's set with all sorts of appropriate Confucian ritual vessels that you used at funerals. And as we continue upward, you can see Lady Dai continuing on her path, still holding her cane, with her attendants following behind. And very incidentally, that's Niwa at the very top center of the robe. And you see Niwa is seated in the coils of a serpent. Let's take a closer look. the assortment of writhing figures seem to be a synthesis of snakes and dragons. So perhaps this is the clue. Perhaps this is the whole idea of transformation, the possibility of a life after death. And the rest of the cloth is surrounded by other very common symbols of Chinese symbology. There's 10 suns. If you look carefully, there's a hare and the moon over in the upper left, etc., etc. During the Warring States in the Han Dynasty, so we're still in that period of about 500 BC to about 200 AD, there was this strong belief in the transformation of all living creatures. This was the age when animals were seen as having the ability to change colors and shapes according to the seasons. They could mutate with changes in the environment. An awareness of nature was beginning to appear in Chinese thought and writing. So the fact that a snake could shed its skin and emerge reborn into a new skin is a very possible answer as to the role of snakes and why they are so important. They offer belief in a future after death. And because snakes and tortoises were both yin creatures, if you remember that original list I showed you of yin and yang beings, and they were both seen as paragons of change, they were eventually coupled together during the Han Dynasty, as you see at the bottom of this rubbing. So now we see the depictions of snakes entwined with tortoises on tomb doors and on artifacts like weapons and pillars and seals, etc., etc. Remember that tortoise shells were used for divination in ancient China? Doesn't that now make sense? Probably used because of this symbolic permanence of transformation or perhaps reincarnation, because of this whole idea of longevity. Very interesting. And here's another example of that tortoise-snake combination taken from a frieze. This used to be on display in one of the museums in China, but in Dunhuan, but I noticed the last time I was there it had disappeared, so I don't know what they've done with it. Maybe it's out on tour. Let's be positive. The combination of the tortoise and the snake also came in time to represent the direction north for the Chinese. You see it on roof tiles, on ancient bronze mirrors, and all sorts of other artifacts. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the ancient Chinese directions, each of the four directions, north, south, east, west, was associated in China with both an animal and a color. So if we look at this Tang Dynasty, 1618 to 907 AD bronze mirror you see in the middle of the picture, you can see, I've blown up for you, the four directional animals. And remember, Chinese perspective is always from the north. You are the emperor. You are standing in your palace, looking down south upon your people and your terrains. So it looks like the directions are screwed up. But remember, you are in the north. You are looking south. This is why if you see classical Chinese maps, they don't make sense to you, because north is always at the bottom, south is always at the top. But if you look here, you see north with the entwined tortoise and snake. You have a bird in the south, the dragon on the east, and the tiger on the west. And in the center of this bronze mirror, just to sort of wrap it up, you see that cassia tree that's being spit out of the mouth of a toad. And on the left, you see the Queen Mother of the West with the mountains in which she lives. And on the right, you see a rabbit pounding the elixir of immortality with which she's associated. So a very, very nice Tang Dynasty mirror that we have in the Asian Civilizations Museum in Singapore. Now, the association of animals with humans arose for a number of reasons. Primarily, these ancient legends I've been telling you about. These early beliefs that one's ancestors may originally have come from animal, or at least possess animal powers. And these beliefs continued for a long time in Chinese history, and eventually evolved into this combined animal-human representations we identify today representing the Chinese zodiac. You saw Fuxi and Niwa depicted as half human and half reptile. Well, by the Sui and the Tang dynasties, the 12 Chinese zodiac animals are also depicted that way, but this time in reverse. Now they have the animal heads and human bodies clothed in official court robes. And this continued for many, many centuries, right up until the Qing dynasty into the late 800s, the depiction of these animals as both zodiac figures and as court officials. Here you see another set. Now, one could say that snakes were part of the Chinese belief ecosystem and were faring pretty well, if you think about it. But then came Taoism and Buddhism. And the conflict between the Taoists and tigers and snakes, well, that first became evident with the Taoism period of monasticism in medieval China. Suddenly you had religious practitioners moving about the mountains, encountering wild animals, and conflicts became inevitable. Now, tigers were obviously the apex predators, but Taoist priests were given the option of either prohibiting them or taming them if they could teach them to transform them into obeying the Tao. But if the animal wasn't obedient and couldn't be trained and wasn't submissive, well, then under extreme circumstances you were allowed to kill it. Snakes were a constant threat, and the ritual killing of them was one of the most visible practices in early Taoism. Early Chinese Buddhists also had to respond to the threat of snakes because they were walking, living, and practicing in the wilderness. And they too had to figure out how to respond to both the accidental as well as intended deaths that might occur because of snakes. And although the early years of Buddhism had begun by Vinaya teachings recommending a number of practices, which very amusing, I found it anyway, to why not wear wooden shoes? Okay. To showing compassion to snakes by practicing catch and release practices, the practice and problem of the snake still continued. So eventually, stories began to appear of Buddhist monks who would have to take the lives of snakes. Now, this was a real problem because one of the most important Buddhist precepts, as we all know, especially for monks, is the prohibition of the taking of life of any sentient being. And there was the consideration of all the famous stories that ties the life of the historic Buddha to snakes and nagas. So when Buddhism entered China, there was, by necessity, a number of encounters and adaptations that had to be made between these Buddhist ideas and these Chinese indigenous thoughts. One of the most challenging ideas was this Buddhist belief in reincarnation, which included the belief that humans could be reborn as animals and vice versa. Over the years, this belief merged with the Buddhist concept of bodhisattvas. So those who withheld their own entry into nirvana in order to assist others, in other words, bodhisattvas. We now began to see in Chinese thought how some schools of Chinese Buddhism began to merge the idea of the 12 zodiac animals with Buddhist beliefs in bodhisattvas and reincarnation. There is only one text that we have left to us, dating to the 5th century, by the ridiculously long name, which I hope I can pronounce, Mahavaipulya Mahastamnipata Sutra, that introduces the 12 zodiac animals as the reincarnations of bodhisattvas who were born this way to travel and teach and enlighten these sentient beings who were reborn in the bodies of animals. So in other words, not every snake is a snake. It might be a bodhisattva reborn as a snake so he could be amongst other snakes to help them with the teachings of the Buddha and attain a better life in their own rebirth. It's quite an interesting thought. This sutra further describes the Buddhist world as existing of 6 realms, right? Gods, demigods, humans, animals, hungry ghosts, and demons, surrounded by 4 seas and 4 mountains, each mountain with caves in which there are reincarnations of bodhisattvas, including animals. So in the south, the mountain of Lapis Lazuli was said to be home to 3 caves housing respectively a snake, a horse, and a sheep, all bodhisattvas in those forms in order to help other living creatures. However, just 2 centuries later, in the 7th and 8th centuries, Chinese Buddhist commentators incorporated the indigenous Chinese thoughts of yin and yang and other Buddhist theories to reinterpret these animals as demonic spirits who could now corrupt the morality of Buddhist practitioners. And stories began to appear in Buddhist literature that link women with snakes. Why not? Aren't they both in that yin category? So these stories featured women who ripped up their husbands' Buddhist scriptures, or snuck prohibited food into the meals of monks, or followed deviant teachings. But the most popular stories were beautiful women clad in white gowns who seduced innocent young men who became romantically involved with them, who didn't heed the warnings of friendly abbots who would try to warn them that these temptresses were not women, but snakes. And the story usually ends, guess what, with the death of the snake. There are dozens of variations of these lady white snake stories in Chinese literature, and I'm sure many of you have been to plays seeing them depicted. Some of these stories are linked with very specific temples or ancient halls in China, such as the 3 stone pagodas in China's West Lake, including one even built in the 10th century believed to contain the bowl that was used by the abbot to catch the white snake who forced that poor young man to marry her. And there are many variations of the stories, but the basic storyline remains unchanged. So for those of you who don't know the stories, you can visit a very wonderful dedicated website, and you can either read the story or you can see it enacted with, I think it's even in English or had English subtitles. So do watch the story of Lady White Snake. Conservative Confucianism seemed to actually support these stories, because in the Shi Jing, one of the 5 Confucian classics, which is sometimes referred to as the Book of Songs, it informs dreamers that the appearance of bears in a dream is an auspicious sign for the birth of sons, but if you dream of cobras or serpents, well, poor you, you're going to have a daughter. Dreams of fish, on the other hand, they mean a prosperous year and marital bliss. So I hope some of you have dreamed. I never dreamed of fish when I was expecting, but okay. Snakes appear frequently, very frequently, in Chinese folk stories and art, and they often seem to get what Americans would call, frankly, a bum rap. And one of the best-known examples is the grouping known as the 5 noxious animals. There are sometimes slight variations, but that snake or viper is always one of the 5 identified as a noxious animal that one needs to be protected from. There are very popular textile designs, as you see in the embroidery on the right, and the woven piece on the left. Sometimes it's a spider, but be careful, because spiders alone is a good luck symbol in Chinese thought, because they descend from above on their strings, just like bats do, which are good luck symbols. So it's only when a spider is with the other 4 noxious animals that it's a sign of bad luck. But one of the 5 bad luck or poisonous animals is usually seen to be a snake. So when snakes appear as one of the symbols of a group of 4 Buddhist figures known as the 4 heavenly kings at the entrances to temples, what in the world is that snake doing there? The 4 heavenly kings became recognized as the guardians of the 4 quarters of the world in Buddhism, and are amongst the most frequently represented protective deities that you find in Buddhist art across all the different schools. And they're found guarding the entrances to a large, I would say even vast majority of Chinese temples. Yet their standard iconographies were developed in China quite late, which is something I didn't learn until some years ago. I always thought they were part of that early Chinese tradition. But they don't appear until the Ming and eventually the Qing dynasties. And interestingly, there's no history at the time for any deities at all to be there holding such things as a lute and a parasol, not to mention a snake. But that's exactly what we have. There is no direct textual base in the sculpture of the Chinese canon for any such imagery. But recent research has shown that these attributes actually come from a tantric tradition related to Tibetan Buddhism that filtered down into China via the Xixia. Those were that northwestern tribe that influenced Chinese history and were adapted more or less during the Yuan dynasty, so about the 100 years from 1206 to the late 1300s. So, why is the guardian of the West holding a snake? And if you look really carefully, a snake with a dragon head? The explanation is that Buddhists can share their benevolence and virtue to all creatures, including snakes, thereby converting them and turning them into protectors. So we are meant to believe that that snake has been converted by the teachings of Buddhism and is turned into now a dragon. And I show you, in addition, 2 more guardians of the West whose snakes' original heads have evolved into little dragon heads. So as we enter the Chinese Year of the Snake, it is important to remember that snake beliefs feature in many cultures. And one last example I want to show you is this one from Burma. What you're looking at is the artwork of a young Burmese artist born in the Year of the Snake, whose work has recently been purchased by the British Museum. And it surprised me to see a modern ceramic artist spending her time at Jingdezhen, a very famous Chinese porcelain center, making a porcelain snake. But that was the subject she chose. Snakes obviously hold a fascination for the Burmese. We know they have snake pagodas. They're not unusual. And there's even a local story, I was told recently on a visit, that when a Burmese python kept returning to one Buddhist temple after being constantly driven off into the surrounding forest, the local monks decided that it must be the reincarnation of a monk who had died recently. So they decided to accept it as a guardian of the temple, and now they take care of it and feed it every day. Okay. So in explanation of the porcelain python, the artist said during an interview, "I find the way that animism is syncretized with Buddhism quite interesting, and Burma has not been alone in this practice. If we begin looking at all the cultures and all the different nationalities in the world, all of them seem to have snakes, and they have some sort of role." Now, those of you who heard my talk last year when I talked about the Year of the Dragon will remember that there were possibly 3 animals that influenced the creation of China's mythical dragon. And so today we've been looking at just one of them. The 3 animals, they were snakes, fish, and crocodiles. And researchers agree all 3 most likely played a role. They differ as to which one they feel played the most important role. I personally think the crocodile, and I've talked to crocodile experts across Southeast Asia who are with me, because the original crocodiles in our part of the world, people, were as wide, they were as big as this room is wide. They were huge monsters. But we don't know. And so the general feeling that most of us now hold is that, okay, dragons, they are obviously not a real animal, but they evolved, and it was probably from this combination of snakes and fish and crocodiles. So the decision as to whether snakes inspired dragons in China, or whether they were always regarded as separate creatures, or whether, in fact, as the curator of that museum said, they're actually just deified snakes, well, I'm going to leave up to you to decide. So thank you very much, and may everyone have a very happy Year of the Snake.
Wow, wonderful. Well, your talk slid through very smoothly. Now, do we have any questions so far? We have microphones around. Please raise your hand and pass the microphone to you.
I've just told you there are no answers.
It said it's the year of the wooden snake.
Yes.
What other snakes are then? What determines that it's, I suppose it's a cycle that makes it the wooden one. But
It is a cycle, and I think I'm now brain dead at 8 o'clock. Somebody help me. Eileen, can you help me here on the other substances? There are 5 elements. Wood.
You've got 12 times 5 is 60.
Right, and that
So
gives us our
60 makes a
60-year
complete cycle. So you have the wood, the fire, earth and all that. Water, what's the other one? I can't remember.
Metal.
Yeah, metal.
Right, yeah. And that gives us, as Eileen said, our 60-year cycle.
Snake itself belong to earth element.
Yes, so, thank you. Okay, this is great. No more questions. Thank you very much. I'll stay up here if anybody actually wants to talk about snakes. Come and talk to me. I want you to know that snake that I came across, that picture I showed you, my daughter, who is visiting from Norway with me and is with me today at this talk, since she was a little girl, has loved snakes. Wherever we went, she always wanted to see snakes, no matter where we were. So when I saw that snake, I quick snapped a picture and I sent it to her on my phone, and within 3 minutes she came back with the answer, "Don't worry, Mommy, it's just a water snake." So there you have it. No need to be afraid of snakes just because it's a snake.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering. I have a good friend from China, and he was dating a girl, and he's like, "I can't marry her because I'm a horse and she's a horse, and we don't get along." And I'm just wondering, do Chinese people consider this when they're thinking about marriage, like a snake and a horse or a tiger?
They used to. Some still do. I think most people now do it just out of sort of fun or mirth, right? I don't think that really holds back any young lovers from getting married. It shouldn't.
Just a comment for people that have been in Burma. Up until 4 or 5 years ago, there's almost no insurance for anything in Burma, but there's always been insurance for snake bites. And if you in rural areas, one of the predominant ways of dying is a snake bite. So it's really a very serious thing there. I don't know if it's the same in Thailand or not.
Is there snake insurance?
I don't know about this. Do we have snake insurance? I never heard of it. We do have snake farm, and that's why we produce serum for for treatment. But I never heard about snake bites and things like that as part of insurance. Please.
If we're going to do snake anecdotes about Burma, I can add one, which is that I was in Mandalay doing research and met a snake doctor. And it used to be that every village had them, and they were, anti-venom specialists. But the other thing that they did is they would give you the magical tattoos on your ankles to keep you from getting bitten. So I went to him actually with that assumption, because it used to be an important career. And I sat down and I said, well, how much money do you make in a year, and this and that? And he said, oh, you got to understand it's not a good job anymore, because since they've opened up the border with China, there's so much money in selling poisonous snakes for food that if in a year there's 2 people who are bitten, that's it. So globalization has also affected the snake bite business.
Great story. Thank you very much.
Strangely enough, snake is the yin side, cooler side. But if you eat snake soup, that's a yang. It warms you up in winter.
Figured that one out.
Yes.
Okay, thank you again. And if you have any questions, come on.
Thank you very much, Kun Patricia Welch. And we have a little token of appreciation for you or not? No, me. Yes.